According to much impressed Thucydides, at the commencement of the battle, the Spartan army officers grouped the hoplites and their lines started moving forward, with some wearing wreaths, while the king began to sing one of many marching songs composed by Terteos. He was complemented by pipers who played the familiar tune, thus serving as a powerful auditory accompaniment to the progressing Spartan army. Interestingly, as with many Greek customs, there might have been a practical side underneath this seemingly religious veneer. To that end, the songs and their tunes kept the marching line of Greek hoplites in order, which entailed a major battlefield tactic, since Greek warfare generally involved closing in with the enemy with a solid, unbroken line. This incredible auditory scope ended in a crescendo with the collective, yet sacred, war cry of Paean, a military custom that was Dorian in origin. Now one major misconception relates to how Greek hoplites fought and charged in tight unbroken formations. But in reality, many battles didn't even come to the scope of physical contact. In other words, a hoplite charge was often not successful because the citizen soldiers tended to break their ranks and disperse even before starting a bold maneuver. As a result, the army that held its ground often emerged victorious, thus exemplifying how morale was far more important than sheer strength in numbers. And this is where the Spartans shined, since they demonstrated their penchant for keeping up their own morale, especially when the massed hoplite charge was a chaotic and brutal affair. Xenophon, in spite of being an Athenian, heaped his praise on the Spartans by calling them the only true craftsmen in matters of war. And while the Spartans had their well-trained hoplites, the oft-missed military fact is that Persians had their well-trained archers. To that end, the bow was the national arm of the ancient Achaemenid Persian Empire. Interestingly, even some of the regular Persian infantry, equipped with wicker shields, short spears, and double-edged daggers, carried their bows and a fair share of arrows in agoritos, a case that housed both the weapon and the projectiles. As for the dedicated Persian archers, they probably carried composite bows that were rather large by contemporary standards. According to Xenophon, the Persian archers even outranged the Cretans, who were considered specialists in archery from the Greek domain. And beyond just the bow itself, much of the improved shooting probably had to do with the better archery techniques and the lighter arrows preferred by the Persians. Interestingly enough, the Persians also had the advantage in their archers of a different kind. That is because the gold Daric coin, darekos in Greek, was popularly referred to as the archer by the Greeks, since the currency depicted the image of a Persian royal armed and ready to shoot his bow. And thus many of the Achaemenid great kings could boast about how they could conquer Greece with their archers, with a possible pun in the offering. The ancient Persians almost had an obsession with the number 1,000, and as such their regiments were theoretically divided into 1,000 men known as hazarabim, hazara denoting 1,000. The decimal system was also upheld when 10 such regiments were combined to form a division, bavarabam, of 10,000 men. The so-called Immortals, or Amurtaka in Old Persian, were the chosen bavarabam of the Persian king, and their scope of immortality seemingly stemmed from their constant number, which was always kept at 10,000 according to Herodotus. In other words, the casualties in this elite division might have been replaced as soon as possible with the best candidates from other Persian bavarabam. The Persian Immortals were probably very different from the oddly sinister manner in which they were depicted in the movie 300. In fact, such elite divisions tended to flaunt their vibrant and rich uniforms and armaments, as is evident from their accounts of carrying spears with golden pomegranates, silver pomegranates, and even golden apples. The latter mentioned spears were carried by the king's own bodyguard unit of 1,000 men, known as Arstabara, nicknamed the Applebearers. The most popular misconception about the Battle of Thermopylae probably relates to the numbers fielded in the battle. In fact, in many corners of popular culture, the encounter is often depicted as 300 Spartans aided by their ragtag group of allies versus over 1 million vast Persian army. These numbers, however, are without a shred of doubt exaggerations based on flawed historical accounts, modern-day pop culture sensationalism, and of course romanticism. In fact, during the period circa 480 BC, Sparta alone could have fielded over 8,000 of its free adult citizens as hoplites. But historically they could not bring forth their entire army at the Battle of Thermopylae due to religious observances, like the Feast of Apollo Carnia and the Panhellenic Olympic Games. And while these reasons may seem bizarre to our modern sensibility, ancient Greeks formulated strict rules when it came to religious activities, so much so that the Spartans didn't even aid the Athenians in time at the momentous Battle of Marathon during the first Persian invasion 10 years before Thermopylae. This brings us to the question, how many men did each side have in this incredible encounter? Well, interestingly enough, the Greek historian Herodotus, the man who claimed that the Persian forces numbered over 1 million troops, clarified how the Greek side at least had 5,200 men, as opposed to only 300 Spartans. The figure included the over 1,000 perioikoi, the free yet non-citizens of Sparta, Greek contingents from Mantinenes, Tegenes, Arcadians, Corinthians, Thespians, and even Thebans, who probably numbered over 400, along with groups of other Peloponnesians. Modern historians also add Helots to this array of forces, thus bringing the total number of Greeks probably over 7,000 men. The Persians, on the other hand, while undoubtedly having their numerical superiority, would have had logistical constraints to even field 500,000 men, considering the size of the Persian navy. To that end, modern scholarship suggests that the Persians could have carried forth around 260,000 men in their 1,300 triremes. But only a percentage of them were actual soldiers, with others serving the duties of oarsmen, baggage carriers, and camp followers. To summarize, the plausible figure range for the Persian force at the Battle of Thermopylae was somewhere between 80,000 to 100,000 men. Another popular misconception, although more valid, about the Battle of Thermopylae relates to how Leonidas made his last stand in the encounter. And while this statement holds true for the final day of the battle, the initial decision made by Spartan King Leonidas and his commanders to hold the coastal mountain pass at Thermopylae was probably more of a logical tactic than just a noble warrior's duty. Now, geographically, Thermopylae was probably the easiest access point from Thessaly in the north into central Greece, thus suggesting its unique strategic value to the Persian advance. Furthermore, the very position of Thermopylae reveals the force multiplier tactics of the Greeks, with the defensive area being only around 15 meters or 49 feet in width. This mountain pass also secured a location that was nearby to a smaller mountain passage on its left and the sea to its right. In fact, part of Leonidas' strategy to defend his position at what is known as the Middle Gate was fueled by the presence of an existing, although dilapidated, wall that was built by the local Phocians. And while the Greek forces were busy repairing the makeshift fortification, Leonidas also took heed of many of the flanking routes that bypassed the gates. One of these treacherous pathways, known as the Anapaia Path, was actually guarded by around 1,000 Phocian hoplites under the directive of the Spartan king. It is no hidden secret that the sheer level of training, high morale, and phalanx formation of the Spartans allowed them to be steadfast in the face of an overwhelming Persian invasion force on the first day of the battle. The Persian assault didn't prove to be successful for Xerxes, with the heavy defeat rather exacerbated by the constricted landscape of the pass, which countered the Persian advantage in numbers. And Herodotus, while being vague on casualty figures, talked about how the longer spears of the Greeks were actually better suited to the task of engaging the enemy than the shorter spears of the Persian infantrymen. We are also told that the Greeks fought in relays, with contingents allowed to take a break from the front line, thus making the defense more effective with fresher batches of men. However, while much has been said about Spartan obstinacy in the face of imminent danger, one should also understand that Sparta, among most Greek city-states, recognized the practicality of warfare. In many ways, their army was the closest to what can be termed a professional military force in the contemporary ancient world. To that end, an often overlooked ploy in the Battle of Thermopylae related to how the Spartans not only held their positions but also made feigned retreats, to lure the Persians into tighter terrains. And once a large enemy force was cut off from the main body, the Greeks fought by turning around and using their superior melee skills, along with the element of surprise, to destroy them in a piecemeal fashion. This Greek strategy of feigning retreats also didn't allow the famed Persian archers to focus on stationary targets of massed hoplites. The second day of the Battle of Thermopylae also played out in a similar fashion to its previous day, as the Greeks held their positions, while the Persians were unable to make any significant breakthrough. But then came the famous episode of Ephialtes and how he presented himself before the Persian command as a guide for the secret path that would bypass the main Greek force and catch them unawares at the rear. But as we fleetingly mentioned before, once again contrary to popular notions, Leonidas was already aware of the existence of such a path. In fact, this very passage, known as the Anapaia Path, was actually guarded by the local Phocian contingent that had around 1,000 men. But unfortunately for the Greeks, the Persians sent their elite immortals, presumably guided by Ephialtes, who probably set out in their full numbers to make a deciding impact in the conflict. After leaving the Persian camp, by the dawn of the third day, they reached the Phocian Greek position, with both sides rather surprised by the presence of each other. And while the Phocian citizen militia were known for their competent vigilance over the local lands, at least under Greek control, they were simply no match for the elite corps of Persian immortals. In the following encounter during the battle, the highly trained immortals quickly overwhelmed their opponents by focused arrow fire volleys. The Phocian militias rapidly retreated to the higher grounds, and then most of them pleaded for their lives to the arriving Persian forces. Interestingly enough, the immortals, instead of dallying with the Phocian forces, continued their calculated advance into the rear part of the Greek lines, thus ultimately turning the tide of the battle. After Leonidas heard the news of their vulnerable position in the battle, he once again resorted to a tactical decision that ironically entailed making a last stand. In essence, while later tales extolled the virtues of defiance and braveness in the face of imminent death, and justifiably so, Leonidas and his men stayed behind not for their posthumous praises, but for covering a significant part of the army that had over 5,000 men. To that end, when it comes to strategy, the overall retreat of the entire Greek army, while being one of the available options, wouldn't have been a feasible one. This is because the Persian cavalry by this time could have easily overtaken them and cut them off in a piecemeal manner. Another factor to consider is that Spartan law in military matters dictated that retreat for the royal guard, Hippias, should be avoided. Simply put, to Leonidas, who was also certainly conscious of Spartan military customs, it was the matter of saving a significant part of the defending force by rear-guard action or making a prolonged last stand with the entire army that would have caused a greater number of Greek casualties. Suffice it to say, he bravely and wisely chose the former. And this allowed the majority of the defending Greek soldiers to escape from the clutches of Xerxes at the Battle of Thermopylae. But once again, as opposed to popular notions, Leonidas did not make his last stand with just a small force of 300 Spartans. They were probably aided by their Helot attendants, possibly numbering over 300, along with around 700 Thespians and 400 Thebans who, according to Herodotus, were held against their will, although the practicality of warfare suggests otherwise. And instead of occupying the narrow pass, Leonidas ordered his assembled rear guard to advance to a broader area, knowing well that their previously guarded position was now vulnerable to the approaching immortals from behind. The Greek army of hoplites made their characteristic slow advance with shield walls, singing of paean hymns, and ritual sacrifices. Interestingly enough, the orthodox method of marching was soon done with, as Persian arrows began to fall among the ranks. Leonidas, cognizant of the urgency of the situation, ordered his men to sprint along the last few yards and quickly close the gap between the enemy and themselves. This short spurt once again denied the Persians to shoot their concerted volleys at relatively immobile targets. And once the armies met, a furious clash ensued, which resulted in even greater Persian casualties, according to Herodotus. But unfortunately for the Greeks, Leonidas met his demise in the chaotic melee engagement, and his guards valiantly defended the fallen body of their king to the last man. Finally, the Spartans decided to fall back to the narrow pass, and made their stand on a hillock with broken spears and swords, though the remaining Thebans possibly endeavored to surrender themselves and their weapons to the enemy. Thus ended the Battle of Thermopylae, resulting in a Pyrrhic Persian victory and a gutsy Greek defeat. According to Herodotus, the great king Xerxes lost 20,000 of his Persian troops, while the Greeks lost 4,000 of their troops, but modern estimates tend to lower both numbers. In essence, the last stand was not just about the heroics of 300 Spartans, but rather encompassed the gutsy feat of over 1,000 Greeks that included both free men hoplites and lightly armed slaves. In fact, Herodotus even grudgingly mentioned the corpses of helots lying on the battlefield, thus suggesting how some of these slaves willingly laid down their lives for a concerted military effort.